Hello everyone and welcome to this week's live chat with the Tudor Travel Guide, or video if you're catching up with us after the event. So today it's all about how to read a Tudor house. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with how to do so, I hope that this is going to make any visit that you make to any major Tudor property in the future much more interesting and satisfying. So I'm going to be talking about that in a moment, but first of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name of course is Sarah and I'm the founder of the Tudor Travel Guide, your visitor's companion to the aristocratic houses, manors and castles of the 16th century. Now, while we wait for a few people to catch up and join us, I can see that there are already a few people online. I will just say hello to you all and encourage you, if you can hear me and see me, to give me a thumbs up as usual and to drop a comment in the comment box the comment box below the live chat. That would be really helpful. I'm a little bit nervous this week because I was playing with the technology and I scheduled this chat twice and I'm a bit scared that people may be trying to find the other chat. So I'm just hoping that the right chat has turned up and I can see at least some of you are finding your way here. And so it's a big hello to a couple of old friends. That's Cindy. Hi, Cindy. Happy Saturday to you. And hello again, Catherine. It's lovely to see you here. So how is it for everybody in your neck of the woods? It's all a bit strange here. We're half in lockdown. We're half out of lockdown. People seem to be applying rules in all sorts of different ways. So I know some parts of the world it's lockdown, what lockdown, and other people are still very much in the fray. So wherever you are in the world, I hope that you're doing fine. Good. Okay. So today, as I say, it's all going to be about how to read a Tudor house. Now, if you have any questions as we go along, of course, as ever, feel free to post them. And what I'm going to do is I'll try and pick up on some of those questions towards the end of the chat. Now, I will say that I am not an architectural historian. If you know anything of my story, you'll know that I'm a very passionate, enthusiastic student of Tudor history and Tudor places in particular. And having written 2 books about Tudor locations, both the In the Footsteps books and many more blogs since, I've learned quite a lot about Tudor houses and how to make the most of visiting them. Now, before I started writing and before I came to the Tudor Travel Guide, I, of course, visited many beautiful historic houses over many years, and I had a lovely time. But it was only when I really got into reading and researching about Tudor places that I began to unlock their secrets. And as I did so, I found a whole new level of pleasure and satisfaction in visiting them. Because what I found out is that, well, I mean, I guess it makes sense now looking back, but I didn't realise it at the time, was of course there were certain fashions of the day. And the wealthy, those who had money and status, wanted to build their properties in the most fashionable way possible. And so there was a template to how these houses, these aristocratic houses, were built. And what I found out was once you began to understand that template, if you were visiting the property, you could walk from room to room and have a much deeper sense of what room you were looking at, how it would have been used by the people who lived there. And in the really historic places, also, I could start putting events in places. So, for example, Windsor Castle is just a classic example of where today, of course, almost every vestige of the Tudor castle is gone in terms of the interiors. It's been ripped out by the Georgians and the Victorians. But in fact, when you know what you're looking for, you realise that the current Garter throne room at Windsor Castle was once Henry VIII's presence chamber. And of course, in Henry VIII's presence chamber at Windsor, Anne Boleyn was made Marquess of Pembroke in September 1532. So suddenly I found myself standing in this room and I'd never knew before what had gone on there. So it's really worthwhile just digging beneath the surface a bit and learning a little bit more about the template of how these houses were laid out. So I don't know how far we're going to get today. I'm going to start at the beginning as if we were entering the house, and I'm going to take us through some of the key features. And again, these are features that as I have learned to understand them. And some of you may know a little bit more about different things, and you're most welcome to comment about that as we go. And we'll keep walking and we'll see how far we get. We're going to run for about 20 minutes or so. And if we only get part way through, then what I might do is come back and do a part 2. So I'm just going to say a quick hello to Cindy. Hello, Cindy. And to Natalie, who's joining us from Florida. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to have you here. People are gradually joining. Okay, so let's think about, so we're talking about now about aristocratic houses. And of course, the more aristocratic the house, the more wealthy the owner, the larger the house, and the greater the number of chambers. The template that I'm about to describe to you often also applied to smaller manor houses, although they might not have had such grand rooms or quite as many rooms. And I'll try to point that out as we go along. So most Tudor houses would have had a gatehouse. So you would arrive through a gatehouse, often, and again, we're going to be focusing on the most aristocratic houses here, and you just have to scale it down for some of the smaller houses. The largest houses often had an outer courtyard, and the outer courtyard, base court at Hampton Court Palace, often had ranges of lodgings for guests and for courtiers, and they also contained some of the service offices, the offices that kept the palace running. Now, obviously, other palaces such as Eltham Palace had a similar outer courtyard. That has now completely gone. You will see many, if you start to do any kind of digging, you will see many of the larger houses having this outer or base court before heading through a second gatehouse very often into an inner courtyard. Now, so these were called double courtyard manor houses. So if you ever hear that term used, a double courtyard manor house, that's what you're dealing with. An outer courtyard with guest lodgings and service offices, and then an inner courtyard where you would have had the private chambers of the Lord and Lady, King and Queen. Now, sometimes dividing the outer courtyard from the inner courtyard would have been what we call a cross range. Now, that cross range sometimes, for example, contained the Great Hall. And in fact, rather than going through a gateway into an inner courtyard, you might go into the Great Hall, and that would have been your point of entry into the more private distant part of the lodgings. Now, it's true to say that whether the Great Hall was in that cross range or whether it was part of the inner courtyard, you would normally access these large properties through the Great Hall. So very often there would be a porch that would lead into the Great Hall. Now, Great Halls tended to disappear a little bit later on in Henry's reign, as the great public chambers of the courtyard of these palaces began to become less fashionable, and the king and the queen retreated ever more into private chambers. And I think I'm right in saying, for example, the Oaklands, which was a later palace built by Henry VIII, didn't have a Great Hall. but certainly most of the earlier 16th century houses did. And so what you would walk through into the Great Hall at what was called its low end. So if you ever hear the terms the low end and the high end, the low end was the low status area, the low end of the hall, the low status end of the hall. And that would usually be screened off from the main part of the hall by a screen, a wooden screen. And that created a passage, and that passage was called the Screens Passage. Now, so that was there really to if you like, screen off the entrance to the kitchen, the buttery, and the pantry. And if I can find it here, I might be able to show you this picture. So I'll just show you this picture for a moment. This is actually at Penshurst Place, and we're actually standing just inside the Great Hall. You can see on the right hand side just the edge of the Screens Passage, and then you can see these 3 entrances, and this was a very, very common arrangement. So you would have the kitchen would be the central range, and then the buttery, the kitchen would be the central archway, and there was often a corridor leading down into the kitchen area, and then the buttery and the pantry would be on either side. So that was incredibly common arrangement. So the other side of the Screens Passage, of course, was the Great Hall itself, the largest and most public chamber in any large aristocratic house. It was a very public chamber. Anybody could come and go and have access to that. It would be the place that the general riffraff of the court, or the lower echelons of the court, I would say, would dine and would sleep. And you may still find in some of the very oldest great halls, Penshurst Place is a brilliant example of where you had an octagonal hearth which would heat the room, and then of course the smoke would rise and would escape through a central louvre in the roof. Now these became increasingly unfashionable as the Tudor period progressed, and most great halls, think again the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace, that may or may not have had a louvre. That was built in the current Great Hall was built in the 1530s, so a little later on, when things were beginning to change. And instead, the great halls were heated by fireplaces instead of these central hearths. Then at the top end of the hall, of course, you've got your high end of the hall, and that was the high status end of the hall, where you would often have this raised dais upon which the lord, the lady, the king and queen and honoured guests and family would dine and eat in great public occasions. And sometimes you may notice that very often lighting this end of the Great Hall was a beautiful oriel window. And that's usually this kind of bay-shaped window. And that basically was there to light the high end of the hall. So the most prestigious people had light falling upon them. And it was also maybe a place to retire and have more private conversations, should you so wish. So many of you, I hope, and some of you will have seen the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace and will know exactly what that looks like. Now, from there, we're progressing into the next chamber. And I'll just pause for a moment and say hello to Jane. Jane's joining us from Central California. Wow, that sounds lovely, Jane. So that would be the morning for you there, right? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so moving on now into the Great Watching Chamber. So the Great Watching Chamber was the second largest chamber of any Tudor house. Now, you didn't always get great watching chambers in some of the smaller houses, but certainly in the palaces. And again, we're lucky enough to have the Great Watching Chamber that survives at Hampton Court Palace. And of course, this room was used in different ways. It was often used as a dining place for, again, the slightly more high status, not the highest status household officials, but the more high status household officials would dine there during the day. Of course, as the name suggests, it was a place in which also people there were often, guards keeping watch over the entrance to the presence chamber. People would gather and wait and watch for the king or queen to pass through if maybe they wanted to get their attention or beg their indulgence or ask for a favour. And this might be a place that they would wait if they weren't of high enough status to get access to the next chamber along, which would be the presence chamber. So these great watching chambers, again, we're really lucky, as I say, to have Hampton Court decorated. They would be decorated with tapestries. They might, along the top third, be painted with lovely religious paintings, have a frieze all the way around the top, and obviously a lovely ornate ceiling, but very little furniture actually in those chambers. So, okay, so hello, Elizabeth, Liz and Flo in Hove. So that's two of you there. That's wonderful. Lovely to see you. Welcome. And while we move on and talk a little bit about the next chamber. So I mentioned that, and that is the presence chamber. So this is a very important chamber, particularly in any Tudor palace. This principally was the place, particularly in the early part of the 16th century, where the king or queen would dine in public, in essence, although obviously only certain people were allowed in the presence chambers. You had to have a certain status to be gaining access. And it was also used as a dining chamber by the most senior household officials in the royal household. But most importantly, of course, it was also a place in which the monarch, or indeed, very important aristocrats in their country seats, would have also had a presence chamber. This is where, let's go back to our palaces. This is where the king or queen would sit on the throne, again, usually on a raised dais, and under a canopy of estate. Now, a canopy of estate is that richly embroidered cloth that hung above and over the throne. The throne itself, other than being raised on the dais, would often sit upon very, very expensive Turkey carpet. And it was absolutely prohibited that anybody but the king or queen, or I guess other direct members of the royal family, were allowed to stand on that carpet. So it would be here, of course, that the likes of Henry VIII would receive guests, foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, and hear petitions, etc. Now, the presence chamber marks the last public chamber in a Tudor royal household. From there on in, we would be crossing the threshold from the public to the private. And beyond, and I'm just looking at the clocks, I don't want to spend too long today. I'd like to keep it to around 20 minutes. Beyond there, we will be stepping into the monarch's private domain. Now, this was particularly true as Henry's reign progressed. He retreated deeper and deeper into his privy chambers in order to escape the prying eyes of the court. And there was almost like an airlock between the presence and his next chamber, his privy chamber. And I always think of the privy chamber as a little bit like a kind of a lounge. It's a place, it's a private chamber, it's a place to relax, to eat in private, to meet with friends, family, probably to, of course, the Tudors loved gambling, etc. So of an evening to listen to music or to gamble at the dice or cards, etc. We're about to enter into the private world of the Tudor monarchs. But I think what I'm going to do is just press pause there. And perhaps next week we could talk about the private chambers. And of course, there were many chambers. We had things like the Privy Chamber, bedchamber, raying chamber, for example, study closet, and so on and so forth. So quite a few more rooms to talk about. So, do look out for these chambers. I mean, I've seen versions of these at various different places that I've been to. Other manor houses often have a great hall. You may not get a great watching chamber, but there may well be something akin to like a presence chamber. So it's just worthwhile just seeing what you can read as you go through and make your visits. So, okay, so Cindy's asking, do any of the canopies of state or Turkish carpet survive? That's a really good question. I've seen bits of, for example, there's a wonderful bit of embroidery at Hever Castle which has a royal coat of arms on it. I'm not sure where that came from, but it reminds me every time I see it of what a canopy of a state might actually have looked like. Of course, you've got to remember that just like the crown jewels, these palaces and their interiors had to survive the English Civil War in the sort of 1630s, 40s. And Cromwell, we're talking Oliver Cromwell here as opposed to Thomas Cromwell, had a lot of these things dismantled, taken down, got rid of. And of course, fabrics themselves were incredibly fragile, as we see from the Bacton altar cloth, for example, which is part of Elizabeth I's dress. It's just managed to survive, but in quite a poor state. But anyway, yeah, so a lot of the palaces themselves were destroyed in the English Civil War, and one imagines that if the crown jewels could be melted down and dispersed, it wouldn't be too hard to get rid of some of these interior fabrics and furnishings. So Rebecca's saying, thank you, very interesting. Well, thank you very much. I don't know whether anybody else has got any questions about that. But what I did want to say is that obviously some of you will already be subscribed to my blog, www.thetudortravelguide.com. And if you do subscribe, you will know that there are some freebies on offer. The first freebie that you will receive would be a free digital, full colour digital mini guide called Your Tudor Weekend Away in Kent, which covers 3 Tudor properties: Hever Castle, Penshurst Place that I was just talking about. So you get a nice little guided tour of Penshurst Place, as well as Pashley Manor Gardens, which was once a Boleyn property. And the second freebie you get is actually a write-up of how to read a Tudor house. So you would receive your own written copy of that. So if you want a little bit more detail, or you want what I'm talking about in writing with maybe some few pictures to go along to illustrate it, then why not subscribe to the blog if you're already subscribed? Okay, so anybody else say hello to here? Hi Nina, lovely to see you. Yeah, it's great. Today's blog was fascinating. So just in case, for those of you who did miss today's blog, or those of you who don't know me so well, Saturday is almost always, unless I'm really, really busy, the Tudor Travel Guide's blog day. And today I was posting about Gainsborough Old Hall in Lincolnshire. And I thought actually to make that a feature of one of our, a topic of one of our future chats. If you read the blog, as Anthony Emery, who is a very distinguished architectural historian, says it's one of the most complete courtier houses of its period in England. It's out on a limb over there in Lincolnshire. It's not on the tourist trail, but that makes it even more special, because when you do find it, and it's a very interesting place to find if any of you have ever been, it will take your breath away. It's so perfect. It is as if the Tudor owners have just walked out and left it, and it's got this most incredible, authentic, kind of oldie worldy vibe. So Rebecca's saying, just read it and love the article. Thank you very much. And Cindy, okay, I wonder why so Cindy's saying, I'll just drag this in. I wonder why there were few rooms before you get to see the king or queen. Okay, so well, I think the first thing is it's just about status. So you've got a big property, a big house, you want lots of rooms. But it was this sort of sense of grandeur, I think, of gaining access to the monarch. So you couldn't just walk in and meet the monarch. I often think of these houses as almost like a theatre set. They're very dramatic. It's almost like the theatre of royalty. And can you imagine arriving there? You've been summoned by the king, and you arrive in the great hall. There's lots of hubbub, there's servants coming and going, and then there's probably guards going through into the watching chamber, and it gets a little bit more tense. People are perhaps a little better dressed. They might be kept waiting for a long period of time, and then you had to be kind of ushered through into the presence chamber before the throne. Oh, and I didn't say actually that even if the throne was empty, you would have curtsied or bowed to the throne, because even when it was empty, it was still, if you like, a symbol of the king's power and authority. So you had to treat it deferentially. So I think, to go back to your question, I think it was almost, as I say, almost like this theatre of royalty, and the not having access to the king or queen made it really special to do so. So Elizabeth is saying, very interesting. Maybe an idea for a future video would be to chat about furnishings. Yes, it might be. Now, I have to say that's not something I've researched a lot about, but maybe that could be a topic for one of my guest interviews for the YouTube streaming. And in fact, so I'm going on a bit longer than I thought, so I hope that's okay. But I'm gradually getting to grips with the technology, and I'm actually hoping to move to a point where that I can stream directly to YouTube and Facebook at the same time. So we won't have to be doing this shenanigans of Facebook one week, YouTube another week. But for those of you who maybe missed last week or haven't heard, what I'm trying to do is roughly 3 weeks chat with just me, talking about something usually that I have a particular interest in, or maybe that I have been researching that week. So for example, this week I'm researching about Thomas Cromwell's house at Austin Friars in London. Oh my God, I found the most amazing document. It's so exciting. It was like Christmas today. Floor plans, elevations. I've never come across it before. I'm so excited. This Austin Friars is a place that really interests me. I can't wait to write about it and to share it with you. Anyway, I'm getting off track, but the idea is that I'll be doing 3 weeks of talking about something that I've recently been researching, and that I can share all that with you. And then on the 4th week, I'll bring a guest in who's a real expert on a particular area. So maybe Illyri Lynn from Hampton Court Palace, who knows all about and just published a book on Tudor textiles, might be a great person, Elizabeth, to bring in to talk about furnishings as well as clothing. So leave that one with me. Illyri is a fantastic speaker. I know she'd be great at this. So thank you for giving me your thumbs up. And thanks, Catherine. Always fascinating, Sarah. Thank you for your efforts. Really look forward to videos and blog. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, so I think I'm going to bring this to a close today. I've always got too much to tell you. We could be here for quite some time, but what we're going to do is we're going to pick up the private apartments, I think next week, and maybe the week after Austin Friars. And of course, just to tell you that the first weekend in July, I think that's Saturday the 6th, there's going to be, it's Tracy Borman. It's going to be with me talking about the Tower of London, and we're going to work out what we'd like to talk about. But if you've got anything you'd really like to talk about with regards to the Tower of London, then it would be great if you could leave your comments here. Leave that for me. I will be checking the chat afterwards. If you're watching this video after the event, still do leave me your comments as the video goes through, or any thoughts you have about the tower and my chat with Tracy. That would be great. So I think that's probably it for today. I'm really happy that you've all managed to join me. Hasn't been quite so many numbers today, but I think that could be to do with a little bit of technical confusion over where the live stream was going. But it's been lovely to see some old friends here. Thank you so much for joining me. And I just want to say, wherever you are in the world, have a lovely rest of day. And I shall look forward to seeing you at 5 o'clock. So same time, British summertime, 5 o'clock this time next week, and we can pick up our conversation. All right, take care. Bye.